Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Pedro. Thank you so much for listening to this audio for Chapter 2 of our updated FOJ study. This study is called What's Jesus Like? And the main goal of it is to just see God's heart through his revelation to us through the person of Jesus. We believe that he gives us insight into God's character, God's heart, God's intentions, God's cares and concerns, and ultimately his plans for the world and for each one of us. So the verses that we're going through are just snapshots into the life of Jesus. I would start this study off by posing that question that the chapter is named after. What's Jesus like? When you think about who he is, what do you think he's like? That way you can kind of get a little bit of an idea of where people are coming from and, without going into too much detail or spending too much time, just getting an idea of where they're at in that moment. I would also just make it a point to communicate to them like, hey, we really believe that Jesus is the most influential person that's ever lived, as the front of the FOJ study says, and that he, being God himself, is a person who wants to live life with us, who wants to empower us, who wants to guide us, and who wants to just be with us every day. So we really think that it's important to know who he is, because he does ultimately point us to who the Father is, the one who created everything and who holds it all together. Each one of them will be invited to consider what they know about Jesus and whether or not that's true and rooted in the biblical narrative and in reality overall. And so through the study, we hope that they'll be able to find a cohesive and dynamic understanding of who Jesus is as a person. And I just would make a note to them and to you as well that people are complex. Every single person is complex. And so when we think about Jesus, how much more complex is he, being a human, but also totally divine? And I just say that to encourage them to not be discouraged as they find complexity in his personhood. I would also just invite them to think through that what would Jesus do phrase that we've used a lot over the last many years, and just to, again, iterate for them that we want them to actually know what Jesus has done so that they can have an idea of what he would do. At the very top of this study, we have a quote from Brennan Manning, and you guys will read it together, but I'll read it to you now. And the quote says, "We cannot deduce anything about Jesus from what we think we know about God. We must now deduce everything about God from what we do know about Jesus." It's also coupled with Paul's words, which say, "The Son is the image of the invisible God." So these two together frame the study to help them to see, if we really want to know who God is, we need to know who Jesus is. And then from there, discern who God is. So I'll start with this first verse in Luke chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. It says, "Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. Whenever he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and their friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, 'Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you.' 'Why were you searching for me?' he asked. 'Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?' But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and with man." I'm going to hit you with 3 takeaways from this section. The first is that this is the earliest mention of Jesus' life that we have from the Gospels. So that, can be a question in of itself, like, hey, what do you make of this being the first thing that we know about Jesus as a child? And just kind of go from there and see where that leads. because, most of us are in between 18 and above, and a lot of us lack the eagerness and the dedication to want to know God. And we see Jesus at the age of 12 making it a point to get to know his Father. So it really poses the question of, why don't we? And if we don't, what gets in the way? And if we do, what can we still learn from him and apply? Second is that we see that Jesus' aim was to know who the Father was. That was his main goal, and he was surprised when his parents didn't quite put that together. So again, you can ask them the question of, how is it obvious in your life that your aim is to know who the Father is? And then lastly, he was a student and made the most of learning opportunities to absorb and to wonder and to question. We see that the things that stand out about Jesus to the religious teachers in the temple is that he asked questions, that he understood, that he listened, things along those lines. So yeah, I kind of already mentioned a few questions, but some other questions that I would pose and invite you to write down or just kind of tuck away and keep in mind for when you have this conversation with your friend. The first is, what characterizes Jesus in this story? And as a side note, this is just a good question for any of these verses that we're going to be reading because, again, we want to get a good picture of who Jesus was, what his character was, so that we can understand who God is. And sometimes you'll find that they might see something in Jesus that they don't actually think is in God. And you can kind of help them see, Jesus points us to him. So this is a characteristic that you can write down and maybe reflect on and see how that actually fits with who God is. So what characterizes Jesus in the story? Another is, why do you think Jesus would need to grow and learn like the rest? Or if he didn't need to, then why would he want to? And if you don't think he needs to, then why not? Is your aim to know the Father? I mentioned that earlier. What is your experience with getting to know the Father through the words of Scripture? What's that been like for them? Is that something that they are used to, that's been fed to them, that they've sought out? Where are they at? And then how are you as a student of Scripture? Is that a characteristic that you find in yourself as you think about your way of interacting with Scripture? And like I mentioned earlier, what obstacles get in the way and so on and so forth. And then lastly, in what ways could you grow in your ability to absorb, to wonder, and to question, not just about life in general, although I think that could be fine, but more specifically about who God is. Our next verse is Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45. This reads, "A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, 'If you're willing, you can make me clean.' Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. 'I am willing,' he said. 'Be clean.' Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. 'See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them.' Instead, the man went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people came to him still from everywhere." So some takeaways from this section. One is that Jesus allows anyone to interact with him. If you've ever seen The Chosen, the way they depict it is that Jesus is hanging out with his friends. They're, on trek somewhere, and this man from afar sees him and runs up to him. And Jesus notices him, turns around, and walks up to him as well to have an interaction with him. A second is that Jesus feels indignant towards the man, or perhaps it's towards the man's experience with people. It'd be important to look up what the word indignant means and to kind of brainstorm what that looks like in this instance. And then lastly, Jesus isn't tainted by our sickness or disease. In fact, sickness and disease leave at the presence of Jesus. As soon as he makes contact, the man is healed. So a few questions that you could ask. One is, what must it be like to be in the shoes of this leprosy-ridden man? Invite them to imagine this with you. How would this affect your interaction with Jesus if you were him? Especially when he reaches out his hand to touch you before he even heals you. Second, what does Jesus' attitude towards this man request reveal to you about him? Do you believe that? Have you experienced that? Third, what things move you to compassion? Note that gentleness isn't equivalent to weakness, and this might be an important aside for you to take with them, especially if they do assume that gentleness is equivalent to weakness and that compassion kind of falls in the same boat. And then lastly, what do you make of the man's statement, "If you are willing, you can make me clean"? This can kind of tie back to that first thought experiment. Our next verse is in Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 17. This reads, "On reaching Jerusalem, Jesus entered the temple courts and began driving out those who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves, and would not allow anyone to carry merchandise through the temple courts. And as he taught them, he said, 'Is it not written, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of robbers.'" Again, some takeaways here. One is just that the temple was operating within reason. It wasn't that he came in and they had turned it into something that it wasn't. It was a place where people would buy and sell. However, it was turned up a notch in the wrong way by being perverted and filled with unjust practices. And so people would go to the temple courts to buy and to sell for sacrifices. However, people who were selling were taking advantage of the people who were buying. And so the temple became a place where it was difficult and people would even be taken advantage of as they tried to connect with God himself and to make the sacrifices for their sins and for sicknesses and all this other kind of stuff. So Jesus comes in and is just totally outraged that there would be so many things in the way of them connecting with the Lord, and so many things that are just defiling the temple, which is where God's presence would most strongly dwell. So that's the biggest takeaway. Some questions to ask here is, where do you imagine Jesus was coming from by his actions? You can, if they haven't quite figured out where he's at, you can ask them that and see how they're interpreting this kind of outrage and this kind of act of Jesus strongly setting things to right that he sees as wrong. Another question is, what would it have looked like for the temple to have been a house of prayer for all nations, as opposed to a den of robbers? Third, what was the significance of the temple at this point? And honestly, you might start with that question so that they can kind of understand the context behind this. And then as a follow-up question to that, where is the temple of the Lord now? And you, if you're not super familiar with the temple yourself, it would be a good idea to spend, anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes just looking into that or asking around to get a better picture of this. Because the temple was the place throughout all of history where God's presence dwelled. And it was a big deal, and not just anyone could make direct contact with him in that way. However, now, through the sacrifice of Jesus and him sending his Spirit to us as a deposit, guaranteeing that God's presence would fully return, we are the ones who are inhabited by the presence of God himself. Our bodies are his temple, and we get to walk around and be walking temples, enjoying the presence of the Lord if we allow him to live with us. That being said, we segue into this next question of how would Jesus feel upon entering the temple of your heart? What would he notice that was defiled and perverted and that he would really want to take a whip to and make right? And then my last question would just be, what does it say about Jesus that he would want to cleanse the temple in this way and he would take it upon himself to do so? And what are the implications of that for the future? Our next verse is John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So takeaways here, Jesus does not join in to the commotion of the crowd. He doesn't get carried away by the expectations of the people. He doesn't even give them an inch in granting them what they wanted, even if what they wanted was subversive. Instead, he cuts through the sin of the crowd and their arrogance and their trickery, really, and through the sin of the woman, and provides what is most needed for both of them. To the people who brought the woman in, he corrects them subtlety and with nuance, but with truth. And to the woman, he corrects her, but with forgiveness that exceeds her wildest expectations, and mercy like perhaps she'd never experienced before. Which really makes a point of how we don't often get what we expect from Jesus, especially when we confront him in true vulnerability. And if you've ever experienced this side of Jesus, it would be great for you to share about that with this person that you're going through the study with. And then questions for this: put yourself in the woman's shoes. What's running through your mind? Do another thought experiment of sorts, like the one with the verse on leprosy. How are you feeling? How are you anticipating this will play out? And what would your response be with the way that Jesus handles this? Another question is, what do you make of how Jesus handled the situation? Are you surprised? Did it kind of go as you expected? And explain where that's coming from. What components in this situation do you think affect how Jesus handled it? Do you think that the fact that the woman was truly humiliated and brought in, caught in the act, that had something to do with it? Do you also think that perhaps the attitude of the teachers of the time had something to do with his response? And if so, how should that inform the way that we expect God to deal with us at different points in time when we come to him with arrogance versus when we come to him in humility? Another question is, what was Jesus communicating to the teachers of the law and the Pharisees about what he really cared about? And what did he expose in them about what they really cared about? Does Jesus discipline this woman? If so, how? And if you don't believe so, what do you make of his final words to her? And then lastly, again, have you ever had experiences with Jesus like this, either from the side of the crowd in which you want Jesus to make things right in the way that you see best towards someone else, or from the perspective of the woman in which you're really just in need of deep mercy and forgiveness? Our last verse is John chapter 13, verses 1 through 15. It reads, "It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with a towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?' Jesus replied, 'You don't realize now what I'm doing, but later you'll understand.' 'No,' said Peter, 'you'll never wash my feet.' Jesus answered, 'Unless I wash you, you have no part with me.' 'Then Lord,' Simon Peter replied, 'not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well.' Jesus answered, 'Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you, for he knew who was going to betray him, and that is why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set for you an example that you should do as I have done for you." Takeaways here is that Jesus serves regardless of his authority and his place. He doesn't even allow the unfaithfulness and the betrayal of others to affect his service towards them. And this is real agape love, the highest yet lowest form of love, which is that a slave would have towards their master, of deep respect and fondness, but also servitude and gratitude towards. Some may see that as a very lowly kind of love. However, here Jesus displays that this is a very high kind of love because it's the love that he displays towards us. So, questions for you. The first is, given what you know about Jesus, would you expect this action of foot washing from him? And you can invite them to really think, in terms of reading up until this point in time, is this something that you would see coming from him? Or is this surprising to you? And then just kind of explore why that is for them. Another question is, what does the way that Jesus responds to Peter's stubbornness communicate to you about Jesus? And ask them if there's ways that Jesus attempts to serve them that they aren't quite fans of, or that they don't always get behind or accept. And then obviously share if there are some of these for you. A big question is, why would Jesus have washed Judas's feet in addition to the rest, especially knowing that he would be the one to betray him? And what does this say about him? I kind of mentioned this earlier, but worth having a conversation about. What does it mean for Jesus to be teacher and Lord? Is this your experience with him? What is the significance of Jesus as teacher and Lord, setting this example for his disciples? And then lastly, how do you demonstrate agape love towards the people around you? And then in this very last section, it's not a box, but it is something worth having a conversation about. Chapter 2 of Philippians says, "Have the same mindset as Christ Jesus." And then it explicitly has questions written down for the two of you to answer together. The first is, how would following Jesus by imitating his mindset change your life? And what excuses do you make for not being like him? And so in light of all of these verses that we've read, you might invite them to go back and read through them again, just do an overview, or better yet, to just look at the notes that they jotted down. In light of those things that they've learned about him, asking these questions will really help them reflect on where they're at, and then also who Jesus is and how they can be more like him. And at the very end, what excuses they make for not being like him. And then lastly, this study ends with a for further study section in which they're invited to just pick one of the Gospels to read and to write down 3 things that really stand out to them about Jesus. 3 things could be, a question, a thing that they noticed, just a highlight about his character, just any 3 things. But we want them to, on their own, after this study, throughout the rest of the week, to be interacting with God through the scriptures and to be really having an ear out and an eye that is keen to figuring out things about Jesus that they hadn't quite seen before through the Gospels, which are jam-packed with stories about his life. Thanks so much for your time, guys.